What's going on, America's history fans? We have chapter 2 of the 8th edition for you today, dealing with the new AP curriculum. If you have an older edition, it will definitely work as well. Make sure you check out the videos in the description below that match up with this, including videos specifically made for the new AP curriculum. So let's get going with chapter 2, American Experiments 1521 to 1700. Let's talk about chattel slavery first, and what your book starts off with in this chapter is talking about something that happens in Virginia, Maryland in the 1660s. It's important to note that Virginia and Maryland are the two colonies that make up the Chesapeake colonies because of the Chesapeake Bay. Virginia and Maryland passed laws that legally defined chattel slavery, or the bondage of human beings. And what these laws said was that the status of the child would be determined based on the mother and not the father. And this is interesting because this ran contradictory to English law. Last chapter we talked about patriarchal societies in which things were based on your father. This specifically ran against that. And the reason why was that children born to slave owners and slave mothers were automatically slaves. Let's start off talking about Spain's tribute colonies. A new American world, an encomienda system was set up in the Spanish colonies. I do have a video on the encomienda system, which is specifically mentioned in the new AP curriculum. Spanish conquistadors were given land from the crown. And the encomienda system was based almost entirely on Indian slave labor. This land that they were given, they were also given control over these Native Americans from the crown, even though they really had no right to control them. The encomienda system was very harsh for Native Americans. It was slavery. They were beaten. They had to work long hours. It was just horrific life for them. But they were very profitable for the Spanish conquistadors and those that owned the encomienda land. A new Spanish social class system develops in the colonies. We have mestizos, which are individuals that are of mixed European and Native American ancestry. Mulattoes are those individuals that are of mixed European and African ancestry. And Zambos are those individuals that are of mixed African and Native American ancestry. These three groups really grow in large numbers. Many Spanish priests sought to convert Indians. A big part of the reasons for Spanish exploration was to convert Native Americans over to Catholicism. The Columbian Exchange begins to develop, and this is the exchange of goods, people, disease, and ideas between Europe, Africa, and Americas. Most people tend to think of this as just an exchange of goods. It's more than that. It is cultural diffusion. You have people coming across, and you have diseases coming across as well. And also with people, you have ideas coming. New crops were introduced to Europe, specifically potato and maize, which is corn, and that transforms European life, especially the potato, which becomes a major crop in Europe and is able to allow for large European populations. One of the goods that it comes over to the Americas from Europe is the horse, and this drastically changes the life of Plains Indians. In some areas after the Columbian Exchange, after contact, especially densely populated areas, Native American population decreased by 90%, and most of that was due to disease. Spain is a major naval power during this time, but we begin to see challenges to Spain's navy. And one of these countries is England. They begin to build up its navy in the 16th century, and eventually they will defeat the Spanish Armada in the late 1500s. England follows a policy of mercantilism, and the purpose of this was to benefit the mother country, in this case England, by exporting more goods than importing. This would provide a positive balance of trade and provide lots of gold and wealth for England. Plantations in the Americas grew as a result of increased demand for sugar and tobacco, especially sugar in the Caribbean and Brazil and more of the tropical climates of Central America and the Caribbean. Later on, tobacco, especially in the English colonies. In Brazil, we have sugar plantations. Sugar growing consists of very arduous labor, and milling was often done on site. So the plantation really would grow everything and then convert the sugar cane into sugar on the spot, and it was very, very profitable for the plantation owners. As Indian populations declined and there were less Indians to either force into slavery or have them work, African slave labor was introduced, and it was really introduced by the Portuguese, who were major slave traders in the beginning. And the more sugar becomes popular and the more profitable it is, the more African slave labor will be used. England is going to focus on tobacco, especially in Jamestown. And here is present-day Jamestown, which looks very similar to what it was 400 years ago. This was a joint stock company where investors would pool their money together and share in the profits and losses of the colony. And originally it was all men, and they hoped to gain gold. Eventually, tobacco became a major cash crop, but that provided challenges for the colonists. The tobacco exhausted land. It forced the colonists to move or further onto other land. This land they would move on to would encroach on Indian land and would lead to conflicts. And we'll talk about some conflicts in a little bit. The House of Burgesses is established in 1619 in Jamestown. This is the first representative government in the United States. These are some traces of representative democracy go back to 1619. In 1622, we have a war with neighboring Indians, and 1/3 of the Jamestown population was killed by Indian attacks, and the English retaliated. And these were just brutal attacks on each other. Jamestown in 1624 became a royal colony under the control of the Crown of England. They're upset with the conflicts with Native Americans, and the Church of England was instituted as the official church, and colonists had to pay taxes to support this church. Let's move over to the other side of the Chesapeake into Maryland, and this was a proprietor colony established by Lord Baltimore. And a proprietor colony means it is a royal grant of land granted by the king. So Lord Baltimore is a Catholic, and there are a lot of Protestants. There's a growing number of Protestants in Maryland, and he is concerned about the right of Catholics to practice their religion. So in 1649, the Maryland Acts of Toleration are passed, which grant religious freedom to Christians only. This was especially aimed at Catholics. This is not religious freedom for everybody, guys. It is only for Christians. If you were Jewish living in Maryland, you could actually be put to death. So this is only for Christians, aimed at Catholics because of the growing number of Protestants. And Maryland relied heavily on tobacco, just like its other Chesapeake colony, Virginia. The Caribbean islands we're going to jump over to. Like Brazil, these colonies focused on sugar production and would have a large slave labor force. Plantations would grow all throughout the colonies, in large part due to something called the headright system. What the headright system did was give 50 acres of land to someone who paid for an immigrant's passage. So if you would recruit people, if you would pay for them to come to the Americas from Europe, you would get 50 acres of land for each person you paid. Now think about this. Who is that benefiting? It's benefiting the rich because they're the only ones who can afford to pay for immigrants to come over. So the rich are gaining more and more land, and that helps contribute to the growth of plantations. Indentured servants were people who, in return for passage to the Americas, for somebody else paying their passage, they would work 4 to 5 years. They would work contracts for 4 to 5 years. Then they could be free, and they could get their own land and marry if they want. Half of all indentured servants died before they became free. So it was a giant risk for you to come over as an indentured servant. And in the Chesapeake, that area in particular used indentured servants probably more than any other area until the late 17th century. There's an event we'll finish this chapter up with that will mark the end of indentured servants there. African laborers were used more heavily in the Caribbean originally, again because of sugar, than they were in the English colonies. That will come a little later. And unfortunately for Africans, strict laws begin to develop that not only promote racism, but also regulate the behavior of blacks. All right, let's talk about New France. And here is a map of New France in the early 1700s. They focused on the interior of the North American continent, specifically Canada and the Ohio River Valley. If you look at this green area here, this is the 13 original colonies over here. And really this yellow area is New France. Quebec was established as a trading post, and they traded specifically fur there. And they also established Jesuit priests who sought to convert Indians. Just like Spain, France focused on converting Native Americans as well. Coureurs de bois were French fur traders who built these elaborate trade networks with Native Americans and would trade furs with them, and they would intermarry with the Native Americans, and for the most part, they had a pretty good relationship with them. New Netherland established New Amsterdam in present-day Manhattan. This was a very small colony, but they engaged in significant commerce, significant trade. Manhattan was a major trading center. And like the French, the Dutch traded first. So New Netherland and New France really focused on trading first. The Iroquois were a group of Native Americans in central and western New York. They traded weapons and goods with both the Dutch and the French. And they're going to have some skirmishes with different European powers, but they will remain a strong force in New York State, in present-day New York State, throughout much of the 1700s as well. Let's focus on New England now. We have the Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower here, and they were separatists that wanted to break away from the Church of England. They had issues with the Church of England, so they wanted to break away and essentially start their own religion. Now, Pilgrims in Plymouth fared much better than other colonists, especially those in the Chesapeake. The weather was much cooler there, much colder there, so you didn't have the disease spreading as much in Plymouth as you would see in the Chesapeake. And they also, like the Virginia House of Burgesses, established a representative self-government. Puritans, not to be confused with Pilgrims, these were Protestants that wanted to purify the English church, not separate from it. So they had beef with the Anglican or the English church as well, but they didn't want to break away like the Pilgrims did, or the Separatists did. They just wanted to purify it. When you think of Puritans, you mostly think of this guy, John Winthrop, and he was a governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. He sought to establish what he envisioned as a city upon a hill. And when he referred to a city upon a hill, it doesn't literally mean a city up on a hill, but rather he was talking about a model society for the rest of the world to look upon. And the Puritans believed in predestination, that idea by John Calvin that God determines your fate before you were born, whether you will be saved or not. And church members in Massachusetts Bay had tremendous power. They were the only ones that could actually vote. And in Massachusetts Bay, they were not religiously tolerant really whatsoever. And we'll see this with Roger Williams and the development of another colony, Rhode Island. So Roger Williams was originally buddies with John Winthrop, but his views were too extreme for John Winthrop. He advocated the separation of church and state. He didn't believe that church officials should also be government officials, and he also advocated religious toleration, and he thought that Native Americans should be paid for their land, so he had better relations with Indians. And John Winthrop and his followers did not like this, so they banished him to Rhode Island. And this is a new colony that was started up, and this was very religiously tolerant. There was no legally established church in Rhode Island. It was arguably the most religiously tolerant of all the colonies, so definitely be familiar with Roger Williams. Another person that shows the example of no religious toleration in Massachusetts Bay is Anne Hutchinson. She was seen as a major threat to Puritans, and she challenged gender roles in church. She claimed to have had direct revelations with God, and she said that individuals could have direct revelations with God. And here she is speaking at her trial, where she was put on trial for some of the things she did. And this freaked a lot of people out, mostly because she was a woman and she challenged these gender roles. She was eventually banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony as well. So let's go over to Salem witch trials, Puritanism and witchcraft. We have the Salem witch trials, which was hysteria throughout Massachusetts in the late 17th century. 19 people were put to death, including this poor guy here who was put to death by being pressed. They would put you could see a piece of wood on him, and then rocks were loaded onto him, and he was essentially crushed to death. If you were accused of being a witch, one of the things, if you were found guilty, that could happen to you was you could be executed. Now, an interesting thing when you look at who was accused and who was doing the accusing in Salem, the accused tended to be wealthier women who were widowed and were middle-aged. So they had property, they had wealth. And the accusers tended to be poorer. And this helped reflect religious and social tensions going on at the time. Most of the accused witches were independent, which helped challenge Puritan society. After the hysteria ended, prosecution for witchcraft declined rapidly, and many colonists started to embrace this new movement that is beginning to develop in Europe, and its ideas are coming over to the colonies, and that is called the Enlightenment. I do have a video on the Enlightenment in the description below. We'll talk about that more in the coming chapters. So let's talk about New England with Native Americans, their Indian wars. We have the Puritan-Pequot War. The Pequots were allied with the Dutch, and they had conflicts with English settlers. So 500 men, women, and English children, English settler children, were massacred by Indians, and New England retaliated very harshly and gained land from the Native Americans that they just attacked. So these are like a series of skirmishes between the two sides. Now, some people question whether it was okay to treat the Native Americans this way, and then you have people like John Winthrop, again, the governor of Massachusetts, who said that the Native Americans dying from diseases such as smallpox was essentially God's work, that if God wanted them to be here, then these diseases would not have killed them. That was the argument to justify the treatment of Native Americans. We have Metacom's War, which is also known as King Philip's War. Now, King Philip and Metacom are the exact same person. Metacom is the Native American who the colonists called King Philip. And this war lasted between 1675 and 1676. Metacom was the leader of the Wampanoags, and they fought with New England, and eventually Metacom is killed, and after that, Native Americans are rarely a threat in New England. So definitely know that after King Philip's War in 1676, Native Americans in New England are hardly a threat any longer. We'll finish up talking about Bacon's Rebellion, which is one of the most significant events from colonial American history. Governor Berkeley is the governor of Virginia, of Jamestown. He did not allow settlement past a specific line in Jamestown because there were Native Americans past that line. Well, in the west of Jamestown, many farmers, these poor farmers, were underrepresented in the House of Burgesses, and they also wanted more land, so they would go and encroach on this Native American land, and this would lead to conflict between natives and Westerners, these mostly poor farmers, who were represented by Bacon, Nathaniel Bacon. So Bacon leads this rebellion, burns down Jamestown. He almost takes control of the entire city, and he suddenly dies of a disease. And here's a famous painting. You can see there's fire going on. I mean, he and his followers really did serious damage. Governor Berkeley actually had to flee for a little while. But what we want to focus on is what is the significance of Bacon's Rebellion. Well, from this moment forward, we're going to see a movement towards slaves for labor. And it also showed tension between the rich and the poor in the East and the West. So you may be asking yourself, why is there a movement towards slaves? Because of Bacon's Rebellion. Well, a lot of these people involved in the rebellion were former indentured servants who wanted land, who were free. So a lot of people in Virginia are going to realize that indentured servants who gain freedom will want land. So if they switch over to slaves who are never given their freedom, they can never demand land. So if you ever have to write an essay about the origins of slavery or the reasons for the increase of slavery in the British colonies, you can definitely reference Bacon's Rebellion. All right, we'll do a quick recap of this chapter. Columbian Exchange includes diseases as well as goods, potatoes, maize, horses. Maryland Acts of Toleration applied only to Christians, specifically Catholics. The headright system allowed the rich to gain more land, and indentured servants served for 4 or 5 years and gained their freedom, although only half of them actually did. The Chesapeake focused on indentured servants and tobacco originally, which would exhaust the land, cause an expansion onto Indian land. New France traded and had friendly relations with Indians, as did the Dutch. No religious toleration in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Roger Williams and Hutchinson are examples of this. And Bacon's Rebellion showed tensions between the East and the West, or the rich versus poor, and it led to an increase in slavery. Definitely know that. All right, that's everything you need to know from America's History Chapter 2. I thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter at APUSH_review. Thank you guys very much for watching, and have a good day.